it is time to move on to our next chunk of talks here. We have a talk now on Linux forensics and IoT. This has been a common requested talk for a couple of years that attendees say, hey, I wish we had more talks on this. And every year we're like, we can only do what people submit. So we're very happy this year that we have a talk on Linux forensics and IoT. And that is why it was probably voted so highly, because this has been a highly requested topic. So Ali and Joe are here to talk about Linux forensics and IoT. So thank you.
Hello, my name's Joe. This is Austin. Welcome to our presentation. Thank you to everyone watching right now. We greatly appreciate it in these trying times. This is our presentation, but also the main project that we were working on for the last 2 semesters now. So we've been diving deep into IoT Linux forensics for the most part, and we're here to show you what we've discovered over this time. Me personally, I'm still a sophomore at Champlain College in Burlington, Vermont in digital forensics. I like the major a lot. It's really cool. Austin's the same way. He's also in digital forensics 2nd year, so we're pretty similar in that sense. But unfortunately, Ali could not make it here today. He did have some family things to take care of, so he unfortunately could not be present with us in the lab.
That's all right. I just want to say, big shout out to Ali. This presentation and all the work that we're doing here at the Leahy Center would not have been possible without him. And we're excited to have him take that hands-on approach with us again in the future as this project continues over the next few semesters. So let's talk IoT Linux forensics. As Brian said, this was a heavily requested topic. IoT Linux forensics is becoming more and more important to digital forensics investigators. So first off, let's talk the IoT ecosystem. The Internet of Things is a network of physical devices that connect and exchange data with each other. This can include your smart home devices, health devices like pacemakers, and security-based devices such as cameras. If something can share data with another device, it's worked into this Internet of Things. And as of this year, there are an estimated 5.8 billion devices making up the Internet of Things. That number is going to continue to grow at a rapid rate. Now, as these devices become more and more common throughout people's households and workplaces, they're going to begin to pop up more and more in many different types of forensic investigations.
Yep. So just to go over some other things about IoT devices and kind of our project is we discovered that a lot of security issues regarding these IoT devices really come down to time constraints and under development in terms of how long and how fast the developer can create a device and if they can do it efficiently and at a cost-effective rate. In that, we find that a lot of security problems kind of come from that. And we've been able to exploit those and figure out kind of how to get root shells on these small kind of like seemingly like one use only devices and figure out what kind of information we can get from them.
So the purpose of this project was not only to research those methods that can be used in order to gain access to those devices like Joe mentioned, but also to utilize them in order to extract data from Linux-based operating systems in a forensic setting. Our team's scope for this project encompassed any and all IoT devices here at the Leahy Center. Some of them you can see on the table in front of us, and there's hundreds more on the shelves over there. These devices range from smart doorbells to smart routers, and we've done extensive research on many different levels, many different Linux-based devices at both the software and the hardware levels. We wanted to understand where data was stored within these devices themselves and within the operating system, and how we can extract that data utilizing open source tools in a forensically sound manner. Some of the key data that we looked at were logs, config files, and most importantly, user artifacts that were created as if someone was using this device as a normal consumer would.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the way that Linux stores these files is just the same as any other Linux distribution, but you obviously could do it in a bunch of different ways. For example, we have some file systems listed right on screen here, but this is more of an example to show you that a lot of what we're going to be talking about is familiar, and that's a good thing in our sense, because at least for Linux, it's all pretty similar to each other. So a lot of the shells that you'll get access to on these devices will look fairly similar. The two devices that we're going to touch on later on in the presentation, they're pretty similar in a sense, but they do have ups and downs on either side. So at least with IoT devices, they're very specialized in a way, but they are familiar in terms of Linux.
So something else that's on our radar, but was slightly out of scope just for these preliminary stages of the project. Like I said, this project is going to be going on for the next few semesters here at the Leahy Center. Those are different compression formats that are utilized on IoT devices. So onboard memory and storage is often very limited on these devices, especially with some of the more common devices like the Amazon Echo, which utilize cloud-based storage solutions. These are just a few of the compression methods that the Leahy Center is going to be looking at with these file systems more in the future. So look forward to that.
Yep. So there's different ways to accessing these IoT devices in order to gain a root shell. For us, we used both software and hardware exploits, or at least we researched them and tried to see if these methods were plausible or at least would work within our workflow. For the most part, at least with the two devices that we're going to be talking about, we did use hardware hacking. We did use UART ports with an F232 UART converter, which we'll get into a little bit later. But for the most part, it basically is just an interface that we can get data off physically from the motherboard of a device. And cool thing is that at least with hardware hacking, a lot of the devices that we do have these ports, and a lot of devices still being made today are using those ports as well. So we're hoping that the method that we are slowly developing will eventually become some sort of tried and tested way of getting information off of devices.
So as Joe mentioned, we went with UART communication. And why UART? So UART stands for Universal Asynchronous Receiver Transmitter. And it's a method of serial communication that allows multiple different components within the device itself to communicate together. These pinouts are on the motherboards themselves and are often utilized during the manufacturing process for reading debug logs, as well as gaining access to the device bootloader. However, when utilized on devices with very basic default credentials, admin, root tour, admin password, in the case of the camera over here, it was admin with no password, you can actually use those pinouts to get an interactive root shell on the device itself.
Yep. So how many UART pins do we have to work with, really? I mean, for the most part, at least according to the book that we've been primarily using in terms, or at least to get sort of a basic understanding as to how to do what we're doing here is the IoT Hacker's Handbook. It's an excellent read. I would highly recommend it. But they mentioned that there are 8-pin readouts that are a little different from the devices that we're seeing here, which have 4 pins. And really, that's just going to be your transmit, your receive pins, your power pin, and then your ground pin. Super simple. It's all serial communication. It's going to be bit by bit. So even if you're looking at this from a purely electrical standpoint, it's still pretty simple. And the devices, at least the way that they communicate with each other, keeps it simple. It keeps it intuitive for a lot of developers.
So why are there so many UART pinouts on these IoT devices specifically? The majority of IoT devices use serial communication and protocols to communicate internally through their different components, especially because a lot of these components come from different manufacturers. Serial communication transfers just a single bit at a time, and it commonly utilizes channels like USB and HDMI. The UART pinouts make it very easy to translate these single bits into readable and full information. And as we said, we're going to be able to use that to access the root shells on these devices.
Yep. And a big part of using serial communication, at least in terms of an exploitation method, is you must understand or at least know the baud rate of the device. The baud rate is merely just the rate at which information is transferred. For our purposes, it usually is somewhere in like 9600, or at least for the camera that we were looking at was 115,000. So at least having the right baud rate for a specific device obviously gives you the correct and uncorrupted data from those ports, but it also makes getting in from that method a lot easier, at least in terms of going back to certain methods. We found that a lot of times, even if we would set up a different way to get into a root shell, we would have to go back to hardware hacking and still have all this information with us. So keeping a good set of data from a device while you're doing testing on it helps you a lot, and it makes the process a lot quicker.
So pictured here, I also have one right here in front of me. This is the USB converter that we utilized in order to translate that serial data into readable data and consequently access the root shell on the Linux devices. All they require are individual cables to the TX, RX, and ground pins, as well as those equivalent pins on the motherboard, the device itself, which we'll show you some pictures of later. We actually soldered the wires directly to the motherboard of this camera, as well as to the UART converter itself. And it was very easy. It was very easy to just simply plug it into our forensic machine and be able to access that data. And these UART converters are extremely cheap and very easily available. In fact, the Leahy Center bought 3 of them off of Amazon. They got here within 2 to 3 days, and it cost probably about a total of $10 to $12. So these are just a few, I mean, as you can see here, of the many IoT devices that we have here at the Leahy Center. And we've separated them into 4 main categories. You have your smart home, such as the Philips Hue Bridge, which we're going to be talking about. Security systems like the D-Link 5030, which we're also going to be taking an in-depth look at. You have your basic voice assistants, kind of the preliminary IoT devices that most people think of, the Amazon Echo, the Google Home, the Facebook Portal. And then we have smart hubs, which are kind of like central security points for your personal IoT network. These often work like kind of like basic firewalls specifically for IoT devices and kind of segment them from everything else in your production network.
So now this data sheet that you now see on your screen, this is the big data sheet that we have of every device we have in the Leahy Center. And for us, this was for attack surface mapping. This was to at least check what is available on these devices, what can we access, and do we have exploits? Do we have different ways of getting into these devices? What are the serial numbers? Like what version is it running of its software? If it has a Linux distribution, like what Linux distribution is that? For us, having all this information on hand very quickly, along with having the devices all around us in this lab, we're able to get a lot of this work, which for people like us as sophomores is still relatively out of our reach. Though we're still learning, it makes it a lot easier to have all this information in front of us and to have access to all these devices and to have the information of those readily available makes all the while better.
So what you see here is a little bit of an overview of our workflow with each individual device. I want to give a big shout out to Sid Ramdas. He is also a sophomore. This was his first semester at the Leahy Center, and he works behind the scenes researching these individual devices, filling out the spreadsheet before handing it off to Ali, Joe, and myself. So what happened is we initially took apart these devices and looked for those accessible interfaces. And after that, we did some research on any pre-documented, pre-published exploits that might be out there. And there are quite a few of them. I mean, there's a whole book right here on some of those exploits. And finally, we looked for those JTAG and those UART pinouts. As you know, we decided on UART, and we developed a method for root shell access in a forensically sound manner, which we're going to go into.
And then this is just another Google sheet of more attack surface mapping. This was on the same sheet that we showed you earlier, but at least for this one, this gives us information on ports and services, as well as the Linux distribution or the Linux version that it's running. So again, it makes our job a lot easier to know exactly what's going on with the device before we even touch it. If we have people who are joining the team, or if we have people who might not understand so much about a device or not be familiar with the device, then at least we have this information ready for them as well. So at least keeping a good database of information. We found in a group of a couple guys and a couple teachers that having databases of things makes working on these devices much, much easier. So now we're going to go into some of the devices that we investigated. I mentioned before, kind of touched on the camera. Specifically, we're using the D-Link HD pan and tilt camera 5030L. We ended up exploiting this a while back, and we had to go back to it eventually because we did run into a problem with it. But for the most part, that device and the Philips Hue bridge were the ones that we really focused on this semester and really like took a look at what it's doing internally and what files are saved onto the file system. Because again, it's just a Linux distribution. You have a lot of the same Linux tools and a lot of the same packages that you can utilize. Though it might not be as extensive, you get a lot of functionality out of very basic Linux commands. For the most part, there are a lot of commands that I only learned just this year. And I found that they're super useful to use.
So going into that, let's go through the workflow of those two aforementioned devices. Obviously, this is OSDFCon, and we utilize completely open source tools. And this method that we're about to go into can be replicated easily by anyone with a simple Linux distribution and access to an IoT device and that hardware converter. We use Kali Linux. I also did some testing on Ubuntu. Any basic Linux distribution will do. So step one was data gen and acquisition. In order to make sure what we were doing was accurate and forensically sound, we needed to generate some data on these devices. That workflow can actually be seen here. It started with a basic factory reset, as if you were going to pull that device straight from the box and turn it on for the first time. A lot of these devices are many years old. There's been previous research on it. So we wanted to make sure that we reset that as if it was brand new. We used a segmented network. The router is actually sitting right behind us for just our IoT devices to make sure that they're only communicating internally and not with anything else here at the Leahy Center. And the key point here, as we use these devices, just as an average consumer would, is to make an auditable timeline that we could go back to in the future. That way, if we ever recover any type of artifact that may have been generated by the user, we know for a fact whether or not that action was committed by one of our researchers. And then finally, we connected those devices to our forensic machine. We used a Kali Linux VM actually, although any basic Linux distribution would do, with that UART hardware converter. And that is how we not only pulled off that data from the device, but how we access those root shells, which we'll go over in the next few slides.
In step two, I must be the baud guy. So in our second step, we needed to find the baud rate. Obviously, for us on our Kali Linux distributions, we installed Python and PySerial, which for some reason was not initially installed, but thankfully for Linux, it's really easy to do that. We also utilized a free tool called baudrate.py created by devtty so. He created this tool. It's super simple, which was the best part about it, is that it just outputs serial data to a console, and you can switch between baud rates to figure out which one actually works. For us, it made our time with these devices so easy, because you really just have to press two buttons in order to get the access to the root shell. Really, the baud rate is super important. And at least having baudrate.py, it made working here very, very pleasurable.
So as previously mentioned, we connected that UART hardware to our forensic machine via the USB port, and we connected wires directly to the motherboard. Next, we had to set up those serial ports in Linux. Once we confirmed whether or not the device was connected, we downloaded the set serial command from the internet, and we utilized it to set up those serial ports on the device itself. That made sure that those connections were able to complete themselves on our forensic machine. So if the device is unusable, which a lot of them are at first, it's as simple as just updating those permissions to give the hardware read, write, execute access, to give yourself access to that hardware. And after that, simply using the cu command along with that predetermined baud rate from the Python script that we just talked about, which in the case of this command on screen is 115200, that will start the connection right away. So this is actually a more in-depth view of what that looks like. This camera is also sitting on the desk in front of us. You can see the tiny wires that we soldered onto the UART pins on the motherboard of the D-Link itself, and how it connects to our forensic workstation via a USB.
So just going into the serial communication part of this device, We did utilize another free tool called Putty. You might be familiar with it. And really, this was just because we didn't have our distribution set up yet on our forensics machines, but it works exactly the same way. You still can get access to the Linux file system right from Putty, which is really cool, especially if you don't have access to a Linux machine or even a Mac or something that can natively communicate with it. With Putty, at least, it was very easy. It's very intuitive, and we got the same information both from Putty and from any serial console on Linux.
So what you see right here is the bootloader of the D-Link 5030L. This was the moment that we knew for a fact we had successfully gained access to the back-end system of that camera. There was a lot of trial and error. We had to finagle those wires quite a bit. We had to ensure that ground wire constantly remained connected. There was a few short pins that we had to deal with, but eventually we got that uncompressed kernel image started. And this is the actual back-end Linux of the D-Link smart camera that you see on your screen. And at this point, actually, the camera still began to pan back and forth. We didn't have to disconnect any of the components when we unscrewed it. Everything remained plugged in. The only thing that came unplugged was the Wi-Fi antenna, so it wouldn't have internet capability, but everything else was still functioning properly. And this just shows that it's a very non-intrusive method of accessing this bootloader and accessing the back-end Linux. The camera still operated completely normally. It was still, the video feed was still up, although you couldn't access it from your web interface, but it was still recording video and audio. The camera was completely usable during this process. Here you can see some of the data that is stored locally on the camera. In this first red box that you see here, you can see some of that metadata of the camera itself. We also discovered that some videos and audio remained on that camera, cached in the camera itself on what little storage was available until that reset button, that factory reset, was actually pushed. What you see in that green box there was also an auto-running script that changes the admin password so that this back-end Linux system can't be accessed. However, it was very, very easy to bypass because the bootloader ran for about 30 to 45 seconds before that script even executed. So it's as simple as soon as you start seeing data, simply typing in admin, there was no password, you get access to that root shell, and all you have to do is either remove that script or you can just delay the bootloader sequence from running, and then the device won't lock itself up on you in the future. And keep in mind that this is all before we even gained access to that root shell. This is all information that we're seeing straight from the bootloader. Here you can actually see that our segmented IoT Linux network that we used for data gen that I mentioned was stored locally on the camera itself. And it wasn't transmitted from our device, which we used an iPad Gen 4. We also used a Samsung Galaxy S3 tablet for that data gen. Even when the Wi-Fi antenna was disconnected, that camera still searched for that SSID, and that information was still available and in circulation. And like I said, this was before we even had root access. This was very, very basic level access on the device.
All right, moving right along from there, we're going to go into the Philips Hue Bridge, my personal project, really for this entire project. So it seems it's really just the middle point between your Philips Hue light and your cell phone that controls those lights. It has a good couple features on it, but for the most part, it's pretty basic. It's just you just have a power button on top with an Ethernet port and a factory reset port and a power port. That's about it. But the way that we got into the Philips Hue Bridge was through hardware hacking, same as the D-Link cam. We used the same method. As you can see on screen, these are the pins that we had access to. We soldered some headers onto the bridge itself to access them with jumper cables. From there, we connected that to the F232 UART converter and got data on our computers. And the one thing we did run into at this point was that you couldn't bypass the bootloader, or at least the bootloader wouldn't allow you to get into root shell immediately or give you the option to. We found that by shorting a pin physically on the motherboard, it does bypass the bootloader and allows you to get in the root shell. And the reason I'm telling you this is because we found out one way of getting into the D-Link cam by kind of just like spamming in admin and just trying to get past that certain point. For the bridge, at least we had a pin that we could actually short. Part of the reason I'm mentioning this is because there's going to be these little things that you'll probably run into when working with these devices, like these tiny little exploits that you just got to play around or research online to figure out. For Austin's situation, we just stumbled upon this idea. It's like, oh, what if we just press this button a bunch of times? It just, sometimes things like that just happen to work. With the bridge, it did take a little bit more research, but for the most part, we got the same result. Right, so here is, or at least here's the bridge in root shell over SSH. And I do want to mention that eventually, once we did get into the root shell, we did set up Dropbear and did access this device over SSH. That's currently how it is operating right now. So we can access this device from any computer on the IoT Linux network in the lab, which is nice for our researchers because we can all access it at in parallel, so we can all look at the file system as it's running. You know, this was obviously before we got images of it, but even with just having an SSH, it's nice to have that on hand. Getting into that shell, we do have a default username and password. It's just root tor. Very basic stuff. Again, familiar too, and that's again the thing to really consider is that all these Linux distributions are very familiar to one another, and working with the bridges distribution was fairly similar to the D-Link cameras distribution. So then going on into OS information, just very quickly, we just wanted to show here that you can list almost any file on this file system through this root shell. And you pretty much have unrestricted access to whatever here, given that all of your permissions on these, like since you're root, you have read and write. And if you wanted to, you can just make all the files read and write if you wanted to. For our purposes, we didn't have to because the device let us do that or did that already for us. But if for whatever reason you needed to access something like getting OS information, just changing the permissions as a root user makes getting access super easy because you don't have to do too much other than write in one chmod command. I'm gonna move right along into a ifconfig, an ifconfig command. This is just our network. We specifically were using the IP address 10.0.0.2 for SSH access to the Philips Hue bridge. For us, that was important because we use DHCP in the lab. So sometimes that changes, sometimes it doesn't. So keeping an eye out for that IP address, depending on how your network is configured, helps a lot with accessing the device actually. Then this will be the mount command of the device. For this command, we just wanted to look and see where the actual file system was saved on the device, so we can locate it, image it, and export that over Netcat. This will be your root directory of the device. This shows, again, very similar to other distributions, your main folders. You can see that you have your home folder, as well as your etc. folder, bin folder, and all these hold the same kind of information. The way that those binaries are used is completely up to how the developer wants to use them, obviously. And for the bridge, a lot of that information is stored just in this root folder, just kind of just right at the beginning of it. There isn't a huge amount of structure to it. So we're going to move on into this netstat command. This is just to confirm that the services that we were claiming, at least on our data sheet, that we had access to, or at least we could access, were actually accessible from the device. You can see that here. You could also see that the Dropbear program, kind of halfway down this list, this was not enabled by default. This was something that we enabled ourselves in order to get SSH on this device.
So what you see here is a lot of services and tools pointing to BusyBox. So if you don't know what BusyBox is a collection of different Unix tools, and it provides them all wrapped up in one nice single small executable. It's completely customizable, and it's often used to get certain tools onto those IoT bootloaders and the file system themselves for debugging and developmental purposes. The importance of showing this here is that all these devices have these pre-installed tools. For example, if you look on the Philips Hue bridge, this is what you're showing right here, you can see halfway down the list there, the DD command. We actually use that tool to image the file system itself, and we didn't have to load those binaries separately. But unfortunately, BusyBox, like I said, is completely customizable. For example, on the D-Link, since we only had read access to that, and the DD tool was not pre-installed through that BusyBox distribution, we had to figure out a different way of imaging that file system. But this just shows that these Linux distributions on these IoT devices have all sorts of different binaries that you can utilize and that you can leverage for your forensic investigations. Some of the things that we wanted to highlight here as well are the Mosquito package, which is a broker on the bridge itself. It uses MQTT, which is a publish and subscribe method messaging model, which is often utilized in these IoT devices. You can also see towards the bottom there that the Nginx web server was installed on the bridge, which is often you can use that as either a reverse proxy or a load balancer. You can leverage that pretty much any way you want to. Of course, you can also see the Hue diagnostic tools. This is just, we wanted to showcase how many different tools are pre-installed on these devices that can be manipulated and leveraged in your investigations.
Right, this next slide is just showcasing custom firewall rules that you can configure yourself. Now, this normally would be, okay, except for the fact that this is just an IoT device that you can access yourself or access someone else's IoT device or their bridge. In this example, you again have read and write permissions to this file. You can change anything here if you want and let the bridge run this file as if it was completely normal. This is the same situation for a lot of other devices as well. We see that you can just configure basic Linux files that you might see on just regular distributions on a VM or on an actual machine. These are all configurable, and they can obviously be manipulated and exploited. And moving on, here's just a couple more commands regarding just groups and users on the device. At least for the bridge, you do have a good amount of users and groups, but we're not super sure as to how they're utilized just yet. We just know that there are some very, at least for example, there is the audio group that you can see in the third screenshot here. It sounds like, no pun intended, like that's fairly important for this device for some reason. And, like what does it do? We're not sure, but we just wanted to make sure and understand that it's all there and that all this information is there on the system and it's all imageable.
You guys, we have a couple minutes left in your slot.
So then finally, just kind of quickly moving along, we get into imaging. You can see on the screen right here that we just set up, at least for the D-Link cam, we set up a basic tar zip, send it out over Netcat. For the bridge itself, which we didn't get screenshots for in time, we did send a DD file, a forensics DD file over Netcat and got that on our forensics machines without saving it to the device itself, which was super important because the devices, which I'm not sure if we mentioned yet, don't have a huge amount of data or a huge amount of memory. There isn't a lot to really work with on these devices. Initially, when we were doing this, we found that a lot of the commands we were using, or at least for DD, we weren't able to create that file successfully until we found a different way of going about it. So we found out that if we just send it directly over a Netcat connection, we were able to get the full image file in its entirety. The same goes for the tar files itself. It was kind of a result of not having enough memory on these devices to really work with. So by compressing this file, we couldn't get a forensics image, but at least we got something off the file system. And as you can see here, we just have the full Linux file system in Windows. So big thing this semester, obviously, was COVID-19. it was a big challenge for us to overcome, at least kind of coming into the lab at different times and researching different things at different times, not having the same access to certain things because of restrictions and social distancing. The center itself was locked down, so we did not have the amount of time that we wanted to for the entire project. Fortunately, we were still able to present here. And again, we thank you all for your time. But at least for us, we hope to have more for this presentation because there is so much to really dive into in terms of IoT Linux forensics. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to be discovered. It's such a new field, and we just want to push this forward, really.
Yeah, so like Joe said, there's so much more to explore about the world of IoT Linux forensics, and listed here are just a few of the things that we plan on moving forward with here at the Leahy Center in the future. We want to focus on those common IoT devices. What can we do to make those file systems more accessible utilizing those common forensic tools? How can we acquire this data in a more streamlined fashion? Can we automate it? Is there some way that we can make some type of IoT forensics toolkit utilizing open source tools to make those backend Linux systems more accessible to forensic investigators? That is all we have today. I just want to say, again, a big thank you to Ali Hadi. You can reach out to him on Twitter. Please go show him some love. This project would not have been possible without him. This was all his doing. He set up this whole project. He hired both Joe and I. And it's unfortunate he couldn't be here today, but he's definitely got a lot of information on this if you want to go talk to him. There's also the Linux Forensics IoT channel on the OSDFCon Discord server. Joe and I will both be in there to answer any questions, chat with you guys. You can reach out to us over LinkedIn. Thank you for your time, and hopefully the world of IoT Linux forensics starts to become more and more important to you all.
Great. Thank you very much, Joe and Austin. That's some great material there, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of future work to be done there to find more artifacts and things from there, and there could be some good module submissions next year for various data source processors and various other kind of parsing things. So a lot of exciting stuff for this. So thanks again for that. Hope there's a virtual applause going on right now in the Discord channel.